Hi, I'm Tom Gale, GMA's Director of Governmental Relations. We appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this webinar. We want to start off by briefly sharing with you a message from GMA's first Vice President, Mayor Boyd Austin of Dallas, who also serves as the Chair of our Legislative Policy Council.
Hello, I'm Boyd Austin, Mayor of the City of Dallas, Georgia, and Chairman of GMA's Legislative Policy Council. Thank you for taking time out of your day and your busy schedule to become more informed about our legislative advocacy efforts. I can't thank you enough for taking your time and to stress to you that as elected and appointed officials, you are our most important resource in dealing with the legislature in Atlanta. We have a great full-time staff who does a great job all year round for us, and know that you can call them anytime for assistance. I hope you'll be aware of the things that are happening in the next 40 days during the legislature, and that you'll take the time to follow up on the notices that are sent and on the bills that are important to all cities. We all need each other to protect our home rule rights and to be informed about what's happening in Atlanta. Thank you again and Happy New Year. Best wishes for 2016.
We apologize for the inconvenience, either Iranians or members of the General Assembly who are concerned about the advocacy that we're anticipating this session have caused a little technical difficulties, but we hope that we won't have any for the rest of the webinar. First of all, we anticipate taking about 30 minutes of your time to brief you on some issues that we know GMA's legislative staff and city officials will be engaged on during the upcoming 2016 session. At the end of this briefing, we're going to try to answer any questions that you may have. You may be able to, through the webinar, on the lower left-hand part of your screen, type in some questions. If any of those questions are pertinent to some of the topics that we're discussing, we may take a break to address those questions at that time, but if not, we'll address questions at the very end of the session. Mark Twain once said that no man's life, liberty, or property are safe while the legislature's in session, and that's certainly true for city interests in 2016 and in every session. We want to start briefly by having the GMA legislative team introduce themselves.
I'm Michael McPherson. I'm in charge of revenue and finance issues for the association. I've been at the Capitol for 11 sessions now, and looking forward to the upcoming session.
I'm Rishi Patel. I'm the Associate Counsel at GMA and the legal support for the lobbying team, and the upcoming session will be my 6th session with GMA.
I'm Marcy Rubinson. I cover utility issues and municipal operation issues at the Capitol, and this will be my 10th legislative session with GMA.
Hi, my name is Justin Kernan. I handle the public safety issues up at the Capitol, and this will be my 3rd session with GMA.
And I'm Catherine Fleming. This will be my 3rd session at the Capitol, and I cover environment and natural resources issues.
We've got a very sharp, experienced, and motivated lobbying team, and we're looking forward to representing you at the 2016 session. Let's talk about some policy issues now. This is an issue that, on the heels of New Year's Eve, and also as a result of the law that passed last session, which allowed for an excessive use of fireworks on July 4th of 2015, we anticipate fireworks legislation to be a real hot-button issue. I dare say an explosive issue this coming session. We've had a lot of concern about city officials who, in that legislation from last year, were preempted from regulating the use of fireworks. Justin Kernan's been working with legislators and working on legislation to try to claw back some local control. And Justin, could you tell us a little bit about that, the main policy components of that proposal?
Absolutely, Tom. Thank you. Many of you may have engaged in or heard the celebratory fireworks over the holiday, and like Tom previously mentioned, we have a few concerns. Our concerns lie in the areas of public safety, quality of life, and also local control. As far as local control goes, in the previous legislation, we were preempted from any form of local control. This year, we are seeking to regulate the usage of fireworks within our local municipalities by actually seeking to for you to be able to have the ability to enforce noise ordinances. This will give you a way to have some form of local control if you have those noise ordinances set in place. Previously, officers were not able to actually engage citizens or anything like that because of the fact that the state law would not allow them to. We're seeking to get some of that back. There are a few other issues in the other areas, but we'll stick to local control.
And if you have, there are more details with the fireworks legislation. If you have questions, we'll be certainly glad to address those. But we anticipate a package to be introduced as early as the first week of the legislative session, so stay tuned for that. One issue that seems to be near and dear to all of you who've dealt with the legislature is local legislation. Local legislation typically just needs the approval of your delegation, and it becomes law. Local legislation can have major implications on a city, can affect your boundaries, can affect your governance, and the process to pass legislation is very simple. But one issue arose during this past legislative session in which a city had a major portion of its boundaries removed from a county, and that city had no knowledge of that local legislation moving through the process. We're trying to bring legislation to address this problem, and Marcy's been working hard to craft this bill. Marcy, could you tell us about it?
Yeah, fortunately, most city officials and legislative delegations work really well together to make sure that everybody's up to date on any local legislation that's moving through the process. However, every once in a while we hear about a city who had no knowledge of a local bill that was going through the process. Of course, that can create some very significant problems, as Tom mentioned, for service delivery, for infrastructure. A whole host of issues can arise when a city is not aware of a local bill. To that end, we think it's very, very important that a city receive actual notice that a local bill has been introduced that will affect your city operations. That doesn't mean that once a bill is introduced it can't change. It doesn't mean that the legislator is required to stay in touch with you every single step of the way, but we do think you should know when a bill is introduced. The proposal that we have, it would require a legislator to send a certified letter to the city notifying you that local legislation has or will be introduced. You will, of course, have to stay in touch with your legislator to make sure that the legislation hasn't changed in any way or doesn't change throughout the process. But we think the actual notice will go a long way towards making sure that you stay engaged. This is, of course, very important. This is another reason that it's important to stay in touch with your delegation, and we encourage you to work closely with your delegation every step of the way.
Yeah, thanks for that update. And for those of you who are participants in the GMA Legislative Tracking website, we also have an option for you to get notified through GMA's daily emails about all the local legislation that's introduced. That's just one way that GMA tries to make sure that you're aware of local legislation that's introduced. But we also want to make sure that the legislators have some responsibility for notifying cities directly when a bill is introduced to impact them. Local legislation can certainly impact cities and their operations, but so can revenues. And we anticipate a number of different tax bills, as always, to be considered, particularly in this year, which is an election year. But one tax issue that has been at the fore due to a situation last summer is related to sales tax overpayments and accountability. Michael, tell us a little bit about what you've been doing to work to increase the accountability in the collection of sales taxes, and also talk a little bit about the unanticipated sales tax returns and what liability city governments have when those overpayments occur.
But thanks, Tom. Refunds in general are a huge problem. They happen all the time. They happen in small amounts and large amounts. But when they happen in a large amount, for whatever reason, be it overpayment or the incorrect remittance of sales tax in the wrong locality, it could cause a very serious issue. And so that's exactly what happened in Rome and Floyd County over the summer. They had a refund that they had to repay to a business that was over $4 million. Now that took their distributions away for 2 whole months, causing budgetary issues, and it's not the only time it's happened. recently or in the past. And so one of the most shocking things I think that you have to consider when you look at that $4 million is $1 million of it was in interest alone. Now, the Rome case in particular happened because of overpayment of sales taxes. And so when you think of interest earned on overpayment or earned on any sales tax that's due in a refund, it is 1% per month, which equates to 12% per year. Now, nowadays, that's a real good rate of return. So we believe that the legislators certainly in the Northwest and all over the state are very interested in this issue, and we're going to see legislation that approaches interest in general and hopefully the refund process itself. Now, when a business that has a large tax burden or sales tax burden requests a refund, sometimes it spurs an audit, and those audits they're done by the Department of Revenue. Now, they apply to local taxes as well, but the locals don't have any say when the actual refund is negotiated. And so when you think of the 1% in sales tax 1% of sales tax that the department takes each month from all localities, it equates into about $50 million a year or more. And so the question becomes, what of that $50 million? What do we get from it? Why should a local entity, a city in particular, have to pay back interest on something that they really had nothing to do with, especially with the interest itself? So that's another issue that needs to be discussed. Just what does the administration of local taxes mean, and how that $50 million will be spent. Sales tax is the pulse of the local economy, and as it is the state economy. And so we'll definitely be seeking greater access to aggregate data as we go forward, and I'm sure there will be lots of other issues in the finance and taxation realm.
And we anticipate legislation in the House Ways and Means Committee. We anticipate the study committee that's been looking at this issue to make a recommendation, and hopefully we'll be able to make the case that the city government should not have to pay interest when we have no responsibility for the collection and implementation of the sales tax. That's the state's role, the Department of Revenue's role. So it should be an interesting issue as it gets discussed at the Ways and Means Committee. I want to talk about, when we're talking about revenue, costs. We've got a lot of infrastructure costs. We hear from city officials all the time that it's expensive to maintain infrastructure, particularly roads, streets, and bridges. And we're anticipating this coming session to have legislation that will make it harder for us to pay for some of the costs for road, street, and bridge maintenance, primarily because of the possibility of increased truck weights, larger tractor-trailer trucks on city streets. We anticipate legislation. Can you tell us a little bit about what you anticipate, Justin, from the trucking industry as they try to push heavier trucks on city streets?
Sure, Tom. This summer there was a study committee meeting that occurred specifically for the logging industry to allow for an increase in the amount of weight that those particular vehicles can carry on local and state roads, streets, and bridges. However, the legislature just passed a bill last year to help pay for the failing transportation infrastructure. TIA regions have voted and passed, and the asphalt's not even dry in those regions yet. We are currently trying to. We have proposals that are on the table that will further cause more deterioration on these roads, streets, and bridges. This is problematic, and our roads can't simply afford the damage that can possibly happen on these roads. local governments are responsible for the safety and the upkeep of these roads, streets, and bridges. Therefore, we have to work with the legislature to make sure that the industry does not further deteriorate these pieces of infrastructure.
And the anticipation is that the agricultural industry, and particularly the logging industry, will try to say that when they're loading their trucks that they can't accurately ascertain their weights, and therefore they should have much heavier trucks on our roads. We don't think that that's a very valid excuse. We think that there are portable scales, etc. And we anticipate working with the coalition, our counterparts at the county association, to try to beat back this legislation that we know will increase the costs of maintenance on our roads. Shifting gears, one of the issues that we hear from city officials about, particularly those of you who've been in office for many years, is the issue of alleged ethics violations under the old system of reporting to the State Ethics Commission when you qualify to run for city office. The Ethics Commission was documented as a broken state agency, and we consistently hear problems about those of you who have pending alleged violations under that old system. Marcy's been working again this year trying to bring momentum for legislation. And Marcy, could you tell us a little bit about what we anticipate as far as ethics legislation this coming session?
Yeah, Tom, thank you. We will be working on another ethics bill to try to help the thousands and thousands of local elected officials who have outstanding ethics fines. As Tom referenced, a Department of Audit report was released 2 years ago that documented all of the technology, staffing, administrative confusion that resulted from hundreds of thousands of forms being filed with the commission during that time frame. Several hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of outstanding fines are on the books for local elected officials. However, these outstanding fines are primarily due to confusion and to computer glitches. You add that to the fact that the vast majority of elected officials don't raise or spend any money throughout the course of your campaigns, we think it's time to move forward, waive these outstanding fines, and let the Ethics Commission get on with its current caseload that's much more relevant and important for the public than thousands of dollars of outstanding ethics fines relating to forms that had a whole bunch of zeros on them. Of course, in order for us to be successful in pursuing legislation to eliminate these legacy fines for forms that were not filed at the State Ethics Commission several years ago, we need your help. You need to tell your stories to your state legislators. They need to understand that you attempted to file your form, that your form had a lot of zeros on it, or that you didn't have access to a computer, whatever your case may be. But the legislature needs to understand that by waiving these fines, public access or public information is not being compromised, and that they need to understand that it's very unfair for you to be labeled as unethical simply because there were computer problems and a piece of legislation that just didn't work out.
And I think many members of the General Assembly have heard from you all who have been a victim of the state ethics system dysfunction, but now is the time to remind them of the problems you've had in the past and advocate for a solution that would provide a process to get these waivers in place for those of you who had an alleged ethics violation under that old broken system. Another issue that we wanted to touch on, this is an issue that's really sparked a broad national debate, but it's being played out here in Georgia. And that issue relates to attempts to protect deeply held religious beliefs and convictions of certain people, and it's played out in a bill called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, and the bill is pending in the House. And Rushi, could you tell us a little bit about the two main objections that GMA has to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act?
Sure, Tom. So our two main objections are actually very different from what you might read in the national news or even in the local news. Our two main objections are actually related to taxpayer economics. And what I mean by that is that this bill will actually cost local taxpayer money. And here's how it's going to do that. Is the bills actually say that if your religious belief conflicts with a generally applicable law, which is a law that applies equally to everybody else, that your religious belief can trump that general law unless the local government can show by compelling interest that it's the least restrictive means of enforcing that general law. Now, a good example of this is a noise ordinance. Say someone's religious belief says that they should be able to broadcast a daily prayer to their entire neighborhood or even the entire city over a loudspeaker. Now, this might conflict with your local noise ordinance. So what this could lead to is litigation. So we're concerned about that. And so our two asks are actually really simple. What we're looking for is an ante litem notice, first and foremost. An ante litem notice is a notice that's sent to the city before litigation can be filed. And that notice would allow the city to say, hey, we didn't know about your religious belief. Let's see if we can find a solution before we spend a bunch of taxpayer money in the courts. So we're looking for an ante litem notice in this bill, and that's our first point on the RFRA legislation. Our second point is actually related to some litigation that might not be all there. It might be frivolous litigation. And what we're looking for in this legislation on that front is to say, you know what, if the city wins and the judge finds that that litigation that was filed against the city was just completely frivolous, the city should be able to get back attorney's fees for the cost that they spent in the court. So we're looking for two really simple asks, and they're two asks that you won't see in the national news, and they're two asks that relate directly to your local taxpayers and the money they give the local government looking for good leadership.
That's well put, and I think that it's important for you all to communicate with the legislators the two specific concerns that we have. We are trying to minimize the costs to taxpayers from frivolous litigation, and also figure out a way to get notice to potentially resolve some of these alleged issues before we go to the courts. Every year we face home rule incursions and preemption legislation. 2016, we anticipate it to be no different. These home rule fights, preemption fights, are examples of why we need to be engaged. And Catherine, could you give us a few of the examples that we anticipate, but also talk a little bit about what it means to be engaged as city officials?
Sure, I would be happy to. We expect 3 specific bills that would preempt your city powers to come before the legislature again this year, but I can assure you there will definitely be more than 3 as we move through the session. But 3 that I'm going to call your attention to. The first one has to do with dogs. A bill was filed that would prohibit your city from regulating dogs based on breed. Now, our cities that have ordinances related to specific dog breeds have them for public safety reasons, and GMA opposes this bill. It stalled in committee last year, but I do expect that the proponents of it will try to get it moving again, so we'll be watching it closely. The second bill has to do with your city being able to safely manage its rights of way. There is a bill that was filed that would keep your city from managing contractors who perform work in your city's rights of way based on their past safety violations or safety history. GMA opposes this bill given the liability that it could create for our cities, as well as the serious public safety implications. This bill also stalled in committee, but again, I expect that its proponents will try to move it, and we'll be watching it closely. And then the third bill I'd like to call your attention to has to do with city-owned monuments. A bill was filed that would prohibit a local government from moving a monument, and a monument is very broadly defined under this bill, but it would keep a city from moving a monument except under a narrow set of circumstances. We believe that cities should have the right to make decisions about their monuments, and the legislature and the state should have a right to make decisions about its monuments, but that the state should not be telling the city what to do with its monuments. So we will definitely continue to work to make sure this bill does not move. So all of those bills are great reasons that we need you to stay engaged during the session.
And Catherine just touched on a few main reasons to be involved at the state capitol, but can you tell them how city officials can be engaged during the legislative session?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So there are a number of ways to stay engaged. First, you are welcome to come visit us here in Atlanta. We have free parking here at GMA, and if you come, we'll provide you with a personalized legislative briefing from one of the GMA staff members. as well as escort you up to the Capitol and help you figure out speaking with your legislator and meeting with them and what bills we need your help working on any given day. Second, GMA sends out 2 emails during the legislative session. On Tuesday, we send out session notes, and on Fridays, we send out legislative alerts. All of you will be receiving the legislative alerts, and you will also get a notice about session notes and whether or not you would like to subscribe to them. I highly encourage you to subscribe to them. This is the best way to figure out which bills are moving and which bills are not, and we make every effort possible to keep you informed of what's happening up at the Capitol. Additionally, your GMA lobbyists are going to be trying to tweet more this session, and we would love to have you follow us on Twitter, and we'll be, to find out what we're tweeting about related to what's happening at the Gold Dome, just search the hashtag GMAPOL. Again, it's hashtag GMAPOL. And all of this, all of the bills that we're talking about, we will not be able to be successful on if we don't have your help. We could not do it without our strong membership here at GMA. And so if we ask you to call your legislator at any point during the session or to email them, please do so. We really would not ask if we did not actually need the help. If you speak with your legislator on a bill, or if you hear from your legislator on a bill, we also would appreciate it if you would follow up with a member of our staff. We have posted our contact information to the webinar, and it's an available download. It includes our cell phone numbers and our email addresses, so you can reach us day or night, anytime.
Well, thanks for taking the time to be with us. We are going to have a few questions, answer a few questions that have come in. Please, if you haven't submitted a question and you want to do so, on the bottom left of your screen, you have the opportunity to type in and submit those questions. But one question that came in during the presentation by Michael about the sales tax overpayment, the question was essentially about the Rome-Floyd County case. This was an instance that sparked a refund of over $4 million. Over $1 million of that was in overpayments. And the question was, the understanding of the questioner was that it was a 10-year time period in which the audit was open, thus allowing the retail establishment or the business that overpaid to continue to collect interest. Is that 10-year time period something that we're planning to address in legislation, and how does that impact the 3-year time period that is established in state law now?
Right. So they're referring to the 3-year statute of limitations on refunds. Well, once an audit starts, it may take a long time because sales tax in itself is not the only tax that the person or business asking for the refund may pay. And DOR comprehensively audits at that point. And so it could drag on for a long time. But other states have mechanisms in place that ensure that only a certain amount of time may gain interest. And so, yes, that will definitely be looked at this legislative session, and I'm pretty confident that there'll be plenty of people very interested in making some solution.
Another question that came in was related to the passage of House Bill 170. Those of you who were in Georgia last year remember House Bill 170. It was a major legislative fight, and we feel like we managed to come away from that in a very good stead. The question is basically, do we anticipate the $5 per night hotel fee to be addressed? It's been a concern to some of our cities that are, particularly those on the borders of our state, and also whether or not the exemption that city governments used to have on the excise tax, or excuse me, on the sales tax portion of motor fuel, whether that exemption from excise tax will be applicable to cities and local governments after this coming session. Bills have been filed to both repeal the $5 fee and to give local governments and the state exemptions from paying that new state transportation excise tax. We don't anticipate the legislation to move, but we know that there will certainly be a lot of debate following the introduction of those bills. But at this point, we've heard a lot of members of the leadership saying that they want to let the transportation bill in its current form work for a year or two, and then they'll revisit it perhaps at some time in the future. But we don't anticipate any major revisions to occur this coming session. We had another question. For those of you on Twitter, the hashtag that we're going to be using during the legislative session is hashtag GMAPOL. That's GMAPOL. And if you're able to search and follow that hashtag during the legislative session, as we testify before committees, as we give information about upcoming votes, we will be tagging that in our tweets often. And if you aren't following Georgia Cities on Twitter, we encourage you to do so. We will be using that platform as well to get the word out daily. We have another question that's come in. Let me see if I can read it. Well, it's about the increasing gross vehicle weight on trucks. I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but we're anticipating that the heavier trucks legislation will focus primarily on agricultural trucking, not on some of the more traditional tractor trailer trucks that are running on interstates, but more so the agricultural product trucks, logging trucks, timber, poultry. Those trucks, their argument, the industry's argument, is that essentially as they're loading their agricultural cargo, they can't tell whether or not their truck is overweight. We don't think that's a valid argument. They're able to buy portable scales. They can measure in the field. They can measure on the farm. We don't think it's a good enough excuse to be able to ride those heavy trucks and tear up city streets. We have another question that's come in. If I can get to it. John Jay, get in touch with me. We can talk about that. I think it's more of a specific question. This is a question primarily about an issue that affects a specific area of the state. We'll be glad to talk with you about that. As you know, GMA advocates for cities on the whole and on the aggregate, and we don't get involved in local legislation except to try to make sure that the process works to make it more transparent for you all. If you have questions about legislation, if we can be a resource in setting up meetings at the state capitol, by all means, get in touch with us. We'll be glad to tell you our advice on particular issues, and feel free to use us as a resource. We are, of course, your lobbyists. The questions about the probability of the local legislation that we're working on, and you may want to mention the two study committees that.
Over the course of the summer, there was both a House and a Senate study committee looking at annexation, de-annexation, the creation of new cities. And as part of those discussions, GMA requested that the committees recommend support of the GMA legislation that would require notice or a certified letter to local officials before local legislation is introduced or considered. Fortunately, both study committees did include in their recommendations support for that legislation. So we are very hopeful that we'll get some assurance from the General Assembly that a certified letter will be sent to city officials prior to the consideration of a local bill. However, please do stay in touch with your legislators.
As always.
A question was raised about the fireworks legislation, the hours of use. Could you address the current 2 a.m. time period in state law and what the fireworks bill, we anticipate the fireworks bill to do to reduce that time period for those two holidays in the fireworks legislation pending?
Yes, currently the 2 a.m. exception is for July 4th and New Year's Day, January 1st. Our proposal is on July 4th holiday to keep that at midnight, or to roll that back to midnight, and then on New Year's Day to have it up until 1 a.m. We feel that that's still a considerable amount of time to allow for the celebration of those specific holidays.
We had another question. Anything proposed dealing with property taxes? Every year we have legislation that we see dropped to limit property taxes in various ways. There is a constitutional amendment that has been proposed already, and it's been pre-filed. It would require a 2/3 constitutional majority of both the House and Senate to move forward to the ballot. It has a lot of questions for our GMA staff, particularly how it would upset the uniformity clause of the Constitution and allow for different rates of taxation for different types of properties. We do have a lot of concerns, but that's just one example. There are going to be numerous tax bills that are introduced this session, just like every session. We will make sure that we try to digest those and give you information as they come out, the ones that we anticipate to actually see some momentum. But yes, there will be property tax bills, there will be local option sales tax bills, there will be service delivery bills. It's our job to try to make sure that we anticipate those that are going to actually move, and make sure that when we, as Catherine said, when we send an alert, we're telling you about the bills that we know are moving and we need your help. So please pay attention to those alerts. We've kept you for almost 45 minutes now, and we appreciate you taking the time. For those of you who've submitted questions that we were not able to address, or if you have specific follow-up questions, please feel free to contact any of us. As Catherine said, our contact information is downloadable as part of this webinar. And I just want to thank you all for taking the time to help cities become a major force to be reckoned with at the state capitol. We look forward to seeing you at the Mayor's Day Conference, particularly the Capital Connection Legislative Networking Breakfast. Not only will the Governor, Lieutenant Governor, and Speaker be there, but every member of the General Assembly is invited. If you haven't reached out to your legislator and you're planning to attend Mayor's Day, please ask them to join you at the breakfast. We'd appreciate seeing you there and your legislator. In the meantime, wish us luck during the 40 days and 40 nights of the General Assembly session, and call on us if we can be of service to you. Thanks so much.